Okay. So we are looking at the exit of Vietnam. This is the election of 1968 in which Richard Nixon basically ran on a platform that he would end the Vietnam War, that he would bring peace, and that he would be the peacemaker. He also said that he would not lose Vietnam or give up South Vietnam, but that he would get the United States out of the war as quickly as possible. You can also see that this is a pretty divided nation. Popular vote, he won by 43%, given that George C. Wallace also ran as an independent and took some of the states. And this basically gives us an idea that that the United States was no longer kind of on the same side or really understood or had one view on Vietnam. Vietnam very much divided the nation. And you could see that Richard Nixon, although he won a lot of electoral votes, didn't win the popular vote. So Richard Nixon, he gave a speech called The Silent Majority in 1969, and I've got some quotes from it I'd like you to listen to. I believe that one of the reasons for the deep division about Vietnam is that many Americans have lost confidence in what their government has told them about our policy. The American people cannot and should not be asked to support a policy in which involves the overriding issues of war and peace unless they know the truth about that policy. He's basically accusing Johnson of basically holding the truth away from the American people, and he's basically blaming most of that miscommunication on Johnson. He follows that up with, "Tonight, I do not tell you that the war in Vietnam is the war to end wars. But I do say this, I have initiated a plan which will end this war in a way that will bring us closer to our great goal to which Woodrow Wilson and every American president in our history has been dedicated, the goal of a just and lasting peace. As president, I hold the responsibility for choosing the best path to that goal and then leading the nation along it. I pledge to you tonight that I shall meet this responsibility with all the strength, wisdom I can command in accordance with your hopes, mindful of your concerns, sustained by your prayers. Tonight to you, the silent majority of my fellow Americans, I ask your support. I pledge to my campaign for the presidency to end the war in a way that we could win the peace." And this becomes his main platform, that we will basically end the war and win the peace. This is this idea that the exit from Vietnam will be more than that it will be. The exit will be in a way with this idea of peace with honor. And that he believed that most Americans were behind him. And a poll after he gave this speech showed that most Americans did support his ideas and did not want them to just abandon Vietnam. But also there was still a large majority, there was still a sizable amount that really wanted them to end the war. Sino-Soviet split. This is where basically the Chinese and the Soviets publicly decided that they're going in their own separate ways. They weren't no longer working together for one communist nation, that each of these nations was going to pursue their own path. And that gave the United States an opportunity, because there's basically a chink in their armor that they can go ahead and then recognize China, trade with China, maybe trade with the Soviet Union, play them off each other. And so no longer is the Vietnam War a war against all of communism, but now that the Chinese and the Soviets split, there might be a chance to kind of maneuver the Chinese into supporting or pushing the North Vietnamese to the table. Silent majority is this idea that he put forward, that most of the people in the United States supported the war and supported him. Nixon, as a peacemaker, visited China, tried to create better relations with the idea that they will be able to put more pressure on North Vietnam if we continue to work with them. The greatest honor history can bestow is the title of peacemaker. This is kind of ironic coming from Nixon, and you'll see why in a minute. Nixon's aim was to allow President Thieu who was elected in South Vietnam to remain in power in South Vietnam and achieve this through Vietnamization of the war while negotiating with the Viet Cong and the government of North Vietnam. So basically his two policies, or his change in policy, is peace with honor and Vietnamization of the war. It just so happened that Johnson basically in 1968 started both of these. He started the peace conference, or the peace accords in Paris with the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong. And then he is moving forward with this peace with honor idea, or Vietnamization of the war, which Johnson was saying was the way that they would have to basically win the war as well, was to get the South Vietnamese to take on more of the fighting. 1969, Nixon tried to force the communists to the negotiating table. The expansion of the conflict. What's interesting, in 1970, basically, the Congress limits what the president can do based on his authority given to him by the resolution of the Tonkin Gulf. And so the expansion of the conflict, the secret war, he began to bomb Cambodia and Laos, basically bombing the different installations that were made up the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the different warehouses, the different places, and basically attacked the Viet Cong in their bases that were located in Cambodia and Laos, and attacked the North Vietnamese and their bases there, and was effective in the fact that they knocked out the communist ability to fight, but it was ineffective in the idea that it turned many people against the war. So his number one strategy was Vietnamization, strategy of turning over more fighting in Vietnam to the South Vietnamese while gradually bringing U.S. ground troops home. Nixon hoped that this would give the South Vietnamese leaders time to create a stable, non-communist government. Nixon began to slowly withdraw U.S. forces from South Vietnam. Anti-war activists opposed this plan, calling for an immediate end of the war. And Nixon believed, though, that he had the backing of the silent majority of Americans and continued with his policy of slowly withdrawing. Laos and Cambodia. Nixon was secretly expanding the war. He ordered the bombing of Cambodia, concealed the airstrikes, did not tell the American public about them. When they were later released, this caused a widespread protests against Nixon and the U.S. War. In March 1970, the U.S. in Cambodia. April 21st, Nixon in his national televised speech, where he basically said, hey, we are expanding the war. This brought a lot of that protest. Sent U.S. and South Vietnamese troops into Cambodia, into Laos, to destroy North Vietnamese army bases and supplies. Renewed the bombing of North Vietnam, and Nixon hoped to force the North Vietnam to seek peace. Those attacks within Cambodia and Laos basically gave the South Vietnamese army several years to train and to be ready, because it knocked the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong off their game, and they were no longer able to kind of go on the offensive for a couple years. So that leads to increasing protests. Campus violence. Kent State University in Ohio, 4 students were killed and 9 injured. This was basically the going against or speaking out against Johnson, but then more out against Nixon with this idea that he was expanding the war. This was after the Cambodian bombing was announced, and that 4 students were. So then Kent State University in Ohio, Nixon calls out the National Guard to go and put down the protests, which lead to 4 students were killed and 9 injured. Jackson State College in Mississippi, 2 students were killed and 9 were wounded when the National Guard was called out. Anti-war movement. Polls showed that 50% of the Americans opposed the war. A coalition of clergy, trade unionists, and veterans established a nationwide day of protest called Moratorium Day. And 250,000 protesters made up the largest anti-war demonstration in U.S. history that showed up in Washington, D.C., and was out there by the Washington Monument, basically protesting U.S. participation in the war. There were some radical protests as well that used violence and terrorism to try and knock the U.S. Government off their game. But all told, most of the protests were peaceful, despite the fact that the government sometimes returned those with violence. More on the anti-war movement. March 1970, the U.S. in Cambodia. This was the idea that the U.S. took the war into Cambodia. This brought a huge protest nationwide. There was anti-war protests that broke out and continued at colleges. 4 million college students and high school students staged a walkout on classes. The university presidents and retired military officers wrote letters to Nixon urging him to remove U.S. troops now. Congress was swamped by anti-war telegrams and joined the nation in denouncing the invasion of Cambodia. On May 5th, Nixon pledged U.S. troops would go no more than 20 miles into Cambodia, and U.S. troops would withdraw from Cambodia by June 6th. So again, with this idea of trying to win the war by committing to this because of the protests, the U.S. is hamstringing their ability to be able to fight the war effectively. A couple issues that we need to talk about that brought about more protest and shows just the problems and the problems with the Vietnam War. One is the My Lai massacre. Troops under Lieutenant William Calley just killed at least 450 women and children in the village of My Lai while on a search and destroy mission. The search and destroy, these soldiers were frustrated. They couldn't find anybody that was Viet Cong, and they basically murdered the village after raping many of the women. And this just kind of showed the problems with U.S. troops and how discouraged and frustrated they were, and also that the troops that were going to Vietnam weren't the best America could provide. No Viet Cong were found in the village. The My Lai massacre was kept quiet at first, but former soldiers began talking about it. This atrocity intensified the divisions between war supporters and opponents. Calley was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. He was paroled in 1974. Meaning that he got out of prison even though he was supposed to be in for life. He basically got pardoned. Pentagon Papers. This brought a lot of protests because basically these let the United States or the public know that Lyndon B. Johnson had been thinking and thinking about invasion, that they had plans for invasion, and a lot of these documents showed that the United States and the government, especially under Lyndon B. Johnson, had not been very forthcoming. They had not been telling the truth about what was going on in Vietnam, and this created a lot of more protest against Nixon, although it was Lyndon B. Johnson's government. Nixon went kind of crazy about this leak, and basically this leak winds up leading to him forming a group of body that winds up being indicted in the whole Watergate affair that leads to the first resignation of a U.S. president. Here's the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C. Cooper Church Amendment, first ever military restriction by Congress, ended funding after June 30th, 1970 for any operation outside of South Vietnam. They bar air operations outside of the border of South Vietnam and ended American support for the Republic of Vietnam forces outside the territorial South Vietnam. Basically saying you can't expand this to Laos, you can't expand this into Cambodia. Basically, Nixon is using what's called triangular diplomacy. Nixon's geopolitical approach: expand trade with China, leverage the Sino-Soviet split, leverage China versus Russia, but while trying to get both of them to pressure North Vietnamese into surrender, into favorable peace talks. Nixon as an exit from Vietnam in 1971, U.S. morale had plummeted. Soldiers often put U on their helmets, meaning the unwilling led by the unqualified, doing the unnecessary for the ungrateful. And just speaking about how they know that many of the American people don't want them there. Their officers are often unqualified and what they called like 20-day wonders because they had very little training. And some of the soldiers were sent to Vietnam rather than go to prison. And so there was a lot of issues with that. That led to what's called fragging, or the killing of officers. I will tell you a story that my dad had where he was a sergeant, and one of his soldiers tried to kill him. Basically, they were so unhappy with the way Vietnam was taken out. They were so unhappy that they began shooting, throwing grenades in the helicopters of colonels, just basically attacking their own officers. Nixon had pinned his hopes on the Vietnamization of the war, and that seemed to be a poor choice. The South Vietnamese was tested in the Lan Son offensive. This was a big offensive that would show whether the South Vietnamese could handle it. Nixon sent one South Vietnamese division. That's basically a large group of 30,000 South Vietnamese soldiers. He sent them to basically clear out this section of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Westmoreland wanted 3 U.S. divisions to do this task, but basically Nixon was forcing the South Vietnamese to take on more of the war. Although originally the deployment went quite well because there was 5,000 elite South Vietnamese troops that had been well trained by the United States. They were doing well, but the North Vietnamese had armored equipment from the Soviets and the Chinese and were able to rout the South Vietnamese army, wiping out half of the 30,000 troops that were sent. So 1972 and 73, so in the face of South Vietnamese defeat, Nixon was quoted was saying those bastards have been bombed like they're never going to be bombed this time. He called himself the Mad Bomber, this madman theory, which the idea of keeping the South Vietnamese off their guard, so that he would be unpredictable and they wouldn't be able to say whether they could trust him to not do something crazy. He hit the largest cities and military targets during what he called the Christmas bombing campaign that went through the December of 1972. Russians and the Chinese were putting pressure on the North to end the war because they were tired of financing the war. Nixon was also running out of time and troops, but most Americans, 74%, thought it important that South Vietnam should not fall to the communists, despite the fact that they didn't want U.S. troops to be there as well. Nixon, despite Thio's protests, moved forward with the Paris Peace Accords. And these Paris Peace Accords basically allowed the North Vietnamese to keep their army within South Vietnamese border, the Viet Cong to hold on to the sections of land that they had. And this leads basically to the eventual failing of South Vietnam, as they are not able to resist the North Vietnamese, and they wind up, it ends the war. Thank you. I know this went a little over, but I wanted to go ahead and finish so that we can move on tomorrow.